Hi, I'm Alchemist2, and today I am actually going to read a story that I have recently finished, and the title of which is The Slackard Knight and the Brave Peasant. Synopsis of story: Nephew of the king, Valiant, does nothing to stop marauding monsters. Because of his status, he won the approval of the king, but the princess, DeLis, loathes him as well as his self-righteous narcissistic attitude. Solomon, a peasant, fights monsters, though he hates to due to the fact that he's a pacifist, but deep in his heart he savors saving others and caring for them. Paris sees him slaying marauding beasts and becomes fond of him, but the king doesn't want his blood tainted by a commoner. Therefore, a contest is enacted between Valiant and Solomon for Paris's hand. Chapter 1. Have someone else do it. Valiant DeLis had been chosen long ago to succeed the king, Louis DeLis, on the event of his death, and to have the hand of his fair daughter Paris. Paris and Valiant had been forced to participate in high teas together since their youth. Valiant savored these times with her because she listened to him. At least that's what he perceived. She never paid one bit of attention to his soliloquies about himself and the kingdom he had inherited in the south. Certainly it was far enough away from their kingdom in the north, but hearing about those vast tracts of land was boring. She didn't care about his fame, fortune, or the fact that he was simply nothing more than an idle knight who had his butler Curio do all his work for him. Curio was the able servant, taking on all the knight's duties. Despite this, Valiant still kept his health in peak condition. He wasn't overweight or weak. In fact, in his spare time, the only thing he did to keep him occupied was fencing, archery, jousting, and the occasional dart throwing. Curio had to coax him into these activities, but it was all the faithful servant of the southern kingdom could do to keep the young master occupied. One summer day, all had been happening normally until a band of thieving trolls, ogres, and orcs rampaged through the village outside the castle. Louis had sent word by a carrier pigeon to his brother Lance about the marauders. People weren't getting harmed in the raids, but they were terrified of these bullies. It had been so for thousands of years, and nothing much had been done about it, particularly not by Valiant. Curio had read the communique to him and threw him his sword, which he caught even without looking. He had to admit he was astonished with the young master's perception of movement and sensitivity to disruptions in the general atmosphere. Inaudible sounds that only a few could hear could be caught by an attuned ear trained properly. Go and handle it, Valiant. These people demand a hero, and Louis's armies are out protecting his royal majesty, amongst other things, Curio stated rather plainly. Underneath the facade, Curio was petrified. He was terrified of such gruesome creatures, particularly after having a run-in with an orc with a particularly nasty disposition. He was fairly sure that that particular orc, Hathul, was out for his head on a pike, but maybe Hathul wasn't aware that Curio was a soldier of fortune, chosen for a long line of infantrymen loyal to the crown. Curio had always wanted to be a page, not a fighter. Seeing he had no skill in battle, and having accidentally ticked off some orcs due to his bad translation skills in speaking the orc language, Curio had been taken from the heat of battle and placed inside the castle walls for his own protection. Aren't there other men who will take care of this for me? I have other duties today. I am scheduled to dine with the princess for luncheon at noon, Valiant said, looking at his shield and preening himself, cleaning out his teeth to make sure they sparkled. He clapped for another servant, Bernard, to fetch him a sprig of mint to vanquish his putrid morning breath. As far as Bernard was concerned, it was going to take more than mint to destroy that stench. It was like a dragon swallowed a dragon, and one of those dragons were stewed together with garlic and haggis. Most unpleasant indeed. Valiant responded with his own carrier pigeon, knowing that his uncle would understand where he was coming from, and that he had more important duties to pursue at this time. Besides, the other protectors of the DeLis crown were more willing to defeat those dastardly fiends, weren't they? Chapter 2. Solomon the Blacksmith's Apprentice. Solomon Malachi was a strong, stout, handsome lad who worked hard by the sweat of his brow every single day. He had been born a bastard, raised by nuns, and hadn't been tainted by being no man's son. He had a zest for living and was zealous in his craft. His master, Darius the Wise, taught him everything he knew about smithing, particularly the way of the sword. Solomon was old enough to wield a sword of his own making, and he did after months of slaving under intense heat. He named the weapon Wraith for the eerie sound it made when when swung. Wraith was a bit heavy, but with practice he had no trouble swinging it, and it could he could see himself using it against others in battle if need be. There had been news of the town criers about ogres, orcs, and trolls making trouble and chaos for everyone recently. It was time for the miscreant raids once more. Just like every year, they go gallivanting through the village and strip them bare. It's atrocious, it is, Darius hissed, shaking his head left and right. And will the king's men not take stand and fight for the people? Solomon inquired. Nay, lad, they have other business. They are mainly guardians of the kingdom. The people, commoners like yourself and I, are meant to fend for ourselves. Even that stuffy brat, Valiant and DeLis, he won't lift a sword against these cretins. Darius murmured and spat on the ground with a curse against Valiant, which Solomon thought was a mite harsh. I may be one person, and a peon at that, but with Wraith I think I stand a fighting chance, Solomon stated bravely. Darius had trained him well since his youth, and the boy had mystical prowess when it came to hurling steel and moving quicker than lightning. Do what you feel is right, Solomon. I have faith you will follow your heart's true path, Darius stated before giving his apprentice and surrogate son a Celtic knot that he himself had forged. The intricate talisman had magics that would protect him. Solomon was highly spiritual and didn't debate his existence of such elements in the natural world. In fact, he felt they were always occurring around him. He had been able to talk to such creatures as sprites, pixies, and fairies as a youngster, and such they followed him if they needed guidance or protection from danger. If need be, they would heal him if he was hurt. Of course, they always offered them thanks and homemade honey cakes, which, amongst other things, he was expert at baking, but wouldn't admit to anyone outside Darius's guild or workplace, to show them his appreciation. Somehow he felt the talisman and the Fey spirits would be with him on his quest. After all, he was doing the town a service by chasing the riffraff away. Chapter 3. And don't come back! Even though Solomon had no horse, he had magnetism with animals, especially wild ones. There had been a mustang that had been roaming free, but terrified of the oncoming ogre horde stampeding through the village in the north. Solomon fed the stallion a tart, and immediately they became friends. He named the glossy stallion Midnight, for he felt the name suited the horse's spirit as well as his beautiful color. Midnight would certainly speed him to his destination, though he seemed to know he was heading into perilous territory again. I know you're frightened, Midnight, but I can use all the help I can get currently, Solomon said. The horse worriedly continued his gallop forward, trusting his rider intimately as they raced across the glen and attacked the horde. One by one marauders fell, not from Wraith's blows, but from the charm of the talisman. Solomon had not been told of its magics, but he had heard a legend Darius the Wise had forged it in an experiment using alchemical power. Darius did dabble in the mystical arts from time to time, and he had been a mage, semi-retired at the most. The spell woven in the engraving was fierce, though. It certainly packed a punch, one that sent a field of energy cascading from the pendant throughout the glen and knocking all the ne'er-do-wells off their feet. Frightened, they ran, not knowing what to make of the unusual electric shock they had felt. They soon forgot the encounter completely and never returned to the north. As for any killings, there were none, and Solomon was relieved. "And don't come back!" Solomon yelled, brandishing his sword somewhat menacingly. It was only an act, a mere facade, even if he did have skill in fighting with it. He recalled the sage words of his employer and father figure. When the time comes to use Wraith, you will know it, for you will become an extension of it, and it of you. You are born of the same steel. Never forget that. The words seemed cryptic and rather poetic and dense, but Solomon knew their impact. He knew that Wraith and he were inseparable, and his safety would almost always be reinsured by it. While Solomon was walking away from the victory, he noticed a castle not too far in the distance. From the topmost spires he viewed a rather lovely maiden. She was tan-skinned and her hair dark, raven, and flowing. Her eyes were like rubies, as well as her lips. She seemed to emanate of roses, gardenias, and morning glories. "I saw what you did, courageous one," she said, exceptionally impressed with his prowess. "I nary did a thing, miss. It was the pendant that was the true victor in the fight," Solomon averred. Paris chuckled. "I'm Paris DeLis, she said sweetly, her smile warming the cockles of his heart. He felt his breath leave him momentarily in a sensation of lightheadedness. Surely he had become smitten with the ebony-haired enchantress. "I'm Solomon Malachi. I'm the apprentice of Darius the Wise," Solomon stated. He didn't want to divulge too much of his background to the princess. After all, he had been a bastard, an orphan child left to the nuns of Malachi, which is where he adopted his surname. His forename, Solomon, had been appointed by Sister Clarence, who marked his wisdom in the earliest moments of his life. In the orphanage with the nuns he savored reading every single day of his life. Though he did enjoy playing with his peers, reading was his one passion. "I pray I can be so fortunate to see you again. You have quite the gift, Sir Malachi," Paris said, with a hint of flirtation. Solomon felt his face fluoresce at her gentility and kindness. She then dropped her handkerchief for him, which he caught with much relish. I pray so too, milady. Or should I call you Highness?" he asked, stumped on how to address her properly after bowing politely to show deference to her. "Paris will be fine, Solomon. I shall figure some way to reward you. Mayhap I can discover a way to creep out of the castle and see you eye to eye," Paris said, a hint of adventure in her timbre. "That would be splendid," Solomon said. The two began devising a plan on how they would meet in the Verdania forest, only miles from the DeLis castle. Of course, Paris would have to pull a switcheroo on her parents, Louis and Lynette. One of her servant girls, Millie, was the perfect substitute for her. She could take upon the royal duties of the day. As they solidified their itinerary, the two said their goodbyes, and she sent him a kiss, which he caught giddily, holding it close to his heart as if it were more precious to him than his own life. Then, after saying his farewells for the day, he practically floated back unto midnight and rode back into the village of Millerston, back to Master Darius. Chapter 4. Secret Picnic. It had been a stuffy day in the metal shop, but Darius was ready to close for the evening. He could see the countenance of his young apprentice brighten, and had a feeling that the hard-working smith in training had found love, and he was about to pursue it diligently, courageously, and persistently until the fair maiden's hand had been won. He had already given the young man pearls of wisdom to store for opportune moments. He didn't want to congratulate the youngster yet, because he had not been successful in wooing whatever damsel he had his heart set on. Somehow the old smith and semi-retired mage sensed that Solomon would more than charm the woman who had sparkled his eyes. In the forest of Valerian the two met for a picnic. "Did anyone see you sneaking out of the castle?" Solomon inquired, mischief in his voice. "Nay, good Solomon. Millie, my maidservant, is in my stead. She has all my likeness save my voice. My parents won't know I have gone, and I will return before they are the wiser of it," Paris stated intelligently. Solomon knew that he loved the princess for everything she stood for: equality of the land, a new library for the people, and schools for everyone, no matter what income. It didn't seem that her suitor, Valiant, was supportive of this. All he cared about was adoration from subjects and submission of everyone he felt was beneath him. No matter whatever else was occurring, the whole universe centered on him, like he created it. Why does your father want you to marry your nephew anyway?" Solomon questioned, not familiar with the custom of royalty, even though he was well read. "It will solidify the family line. Once I inevitably have heirs, they will fortify the leading name in the countryside. All of Lycia will become a reality. Only now this country has been known under a former king's name, Morena. But we all remember he died of plague years ago," Paris retorted, remembering her fondness for Grandpa Morena. Thomas Morena was a king that had ruled fairly, and continued until Valiant had been born. Paris wasn't going to change this, since women were still seen as inferior, so she had no desire of being held in that regard. She wanted someone who prized her as equal, not as a servant and caregiver only. The chat over tea, biscuits, watercress sandwiches continued until late that evening. The princess looked at her wristwatch and realized her parents would be calling her downstairs for harp lessons any time soon now. "I must be off. Mother and father will punish me if I am not available for harp lessons. After all, I must be prepared for concerts and recital," Paris said, not really minding this obligatory duty. She had slender fingers, and Solomon was sure she could pluck an Elysian melody to lure unicorns out of their slumbers. Boldly he took her hand and kissed it. which caused her to flush at his affection. "May we meet again soon. I only pray it is sooner rather than later," Solomon said as they parted and ran toward her castle. His heart leapt within his chest as he ran home, both his stomach and his heart saturated with sustenance and love. That night he dreamt of Paris, and coming to a ball, announcing to her father that he was going to take her, even if he had to win his approval. More than likely this was a vision of what was to come, but he hadn't realized this lucid reverie's significance as of yet. He was too wrapped in infatuation to care. Even so, having these strong feelings did not keep him from honing his skill and continuing to learn the trade his father was teaching him. Some day he would own the metalworks. He was only a boy now, but Darius felt this boy's sense of duty, honor, and responsibility would serve him well, not only for the metalworks' future, but maybe even for the land that was to become Lycia.